Hey, kitty, you want to learn some CSS? How rude.
Hello everyone. In this video we are going to learn what Flexbox is, which problems Flexbox solves, and most importantly, we are going to work through 5 or 6 real-world examples of how to actually use Flexbox. Let's begin with the simplest possible example. So here we see a form with 2 rows or 2 fields. And let's imagine that we want to adjust things so that the actual input elements aren't so narrow. Let's imagine we want the input elements to use all of the available remaining horizontal space. So to achieve that, your first instinct might be to use CSS and assign a width value to the input elements. But that is an exercise in futility. There isn't a width value in the entire universe that will do the trick here, because the label for each row is a different width, right? So because the name label is narrower than the favorite color label, that means that the input field for the first row would need to be a bit wider than this input in order to fill up the remaining space in a row. So we're in a bit of a pickle, but this is where Flexbox can save the day. Because with Flexbox, we don't need to assign width values to anything. So let's take a look at the HTML that makes up this form. Here it is. So each row is wrapped in a container div that has a class of form row. And then within each container div, we see a label and an input pair. Now, if we want to begin using Flexbox, our first step is to adjust the CSS of our container elements. So in this case, the divs with a class of form row. So over in my CSS file, here is a rule that's targeting those container divs. Currently, I'm just giving this class a bit of padding, but if we want to use Flexbox, we just tell the container divs to be display flex. Now with this line in place, it opens the door to new ways of sizing the children elements that live within this container. So if we want the input element to flex or grow and fill up the available remaining space in a row, we can simply say flex 1. Now I will explain how this syntax works and what it actually means in just a moment, but for now, if we save this and refresh, we see that that did the trick. All right, now in order to better understand this syntax that we used here, we are actually going to jump into a new example. All right, so I just added this new section to the page. It's just a few headlines, paragraphs, and divs. So this is the first div, this is the second div, and this is the third div. So this is what I'm starting out with, but in another tab, let me show you the finished product that we are going to transform this into. So it's a 3-column layout, right? We have our main column, we have sidebar 1 and sidebar 2. And we are going to use Flexbox to achieve this layout. Let me jump back to our work in progress tab. And let's begin by taking a look at the HTML that creates this section. So it has an overall container or wrapper div that has a class of column layout. And then nested within that div, we see a div for main column, and a div for sidebar 1, and a div for sidebar 2. Now, if we want to use Flexbox, the first step is to target the container or parent element with our CSS. In this case, that's the overall div that has a class of column layout. So I'm going to jump over to my CSS. And here is a rule that's targeting that column layout class. So let's just begin by telling it to be display flex. And without even writing any other code, just with this line in place on the container element, that will make our 3 divs sit side by side. Now currently our main column is a bit wider than each of the sidebars. And in case you're wondering why the web browser did that by default, it's simply because the main column has more content or more text in it. It has more content, so the browser gives it more space to breathe. But just for a quick exercise, let's imagine that we want our 3 divs or 3 columns to all be perfectly equal in width, right? So let's imagine we want 3 equal width columns. So to make that happen in our CSS, here are the rules for the main column and the sidebars. So all we would do if we want them to all be equal width, we could just say flex1, and then I'm just going to copy and paste this into these two rules. And if I save, we see that the three columns are now perfectly equal in width. So this can give us a bit of insight into what this flex1 really means. We can think of this 1 value as our baseline, right? So if we want an element to be the same size as its siblings, we say flex1. All right, now let's give ourselves another example task to understand this syntax even better. So let's imagine that we want our main column to be twice as wide as either of the sidebars. So in our CSS, we would tell the main column, instead of having a flex of 1, we would say flex2. So if I save that, the main column is now twice as wide as the sidebar. And what if we wanted our main column instead to be 3 times as wide as the sidebars? Obviously, instead of flex2, we would say flex3 because 3 is 3 times larger than 1. So 1 is always our baseline. It's the default value if we want space to be divided up evenly amongst the children elements. And then we can use larger or smaller numbers in relation to 1. So if we say 3 here and refresh, the main column is now exactly 3 times wider than either of the sidebars. Now, some of you might be yelling at the screen right now and wondering why in the first example with our form fields, why did a value of flex1 make the input elements use all of the remaining space, right? So you might be thinking, if a value of 1 is the baseline and makes space evenly distributed, and if there are 2 elements in each row here, why didn't flex1 make the input only take up half of the available width? Well, the key to the first example is that we didn't tell the label elements to flex at all, right? We didn't give these elements a flex value. Now, if we did give the label elements a flex value, so if I go into my CSS, scroll back up, here's the rule that targets the label elements. If we did give that a value of flex1, and I save, then yes, the space is evenly distributed, and we see half and half. But the beauty of Flexbox is that we don't have to tell all children elements to flex. And by not giving the label element a flex value, it can just remain its natural auto size. And the input will say, it looks like I'm the only child element playing the flex game, so I'll go ahead and take up all of the available space. All right, now let's get back to our 3-column layout example. So you will remember that in my other tab that shows the finished product of what we want to build, in that example, the main column is in the middle, or in other words, sidebar 1 is the first column. Now, if I jump back over to our Work in Progress tab, if we want the sidebar 1 column to come first, our initial instinct might be to jump over to our HTML and cut and paste and reorder the column divs. But with Flexbox, we don't need to do that, because for search engine optimization reasons, maybe we want the main column to come first in our HTML code. Now, luckily, Flexbox makes it very easy to control the ordering of our content. So I'm going to leave my HTML alone and simply hop into our CSS. And if we want sidebar 1 to come first, we can just say order 1. And then we want our main column to come next. So for main column, we can say order 2. And we want our sidebar 2 to be last. So we can say order 3. So if we save this and refresh, that did the trick. All right, now next, you might be wondering how we can add margins in between our columns. Well, to answer that, we are actually going to jump into a new example. All right, so if I scroll down the page, you can see that I just added this new section that has 3 features. So this is what I'm starting out with, but if I jump over to my other tab, we can see the finished product of what we are going to transform this into. So pretty basic stuff, right? We want a 3-column layout for the blue, green, and purple boxes. We want the 3 columns to be equal width, but this time we want to add margins in between the columns. We can achieve this layout with Flexbox very easily. So I'm going to jump back to my Work in Progress tab, and let's get started by taking a look at the HTML for this section. So we have an overall container or parent element with a class of callouts container. And then nested within that div, we have the 3 callout divs. And they each have a class of callout. So by this point, you know the drill. If we want to use Flexbox, we will give the parent or container element a CSS value of display flex. So let's jump over to our CSS. Here's the rule that selects the parent or container element. So display flex. All right. And then here's the rule that's selecting the 3 children elements. So if we want them to all be equal width, we can just say flex 1. All right, now we will add margins in between these columns like I promised in just a moment. But first, now that our columns have background colors like this, it brings our attention to one of Flexbox's greatest strengths, and that is equal height columns. So notice that the blue box has more content than the green or purple boxes, and yet the green and purple boxes have the same exact height as the blue box. Now, if you've ever tried to create a column layout with floats, you know that equal height columns like this can be tricky to set up. But with Flexbox, we get equal height columns by default. Now this is really nice, but let's imagine for some reason you didn't want equal height columns. So for example, if you wanted the green box to shrink wrap to its actual height and the purple box as well, what you could do is go into your CSS and on the rule that targets your container or parent element, you can add a new property that says align items and give it a value of flex-start. So now notice that the green and purple boxes are using their natural height. Now notice that all 3 columns are starting at the top, but if we change this to flex end, now the 3 columns will align so the bottom edge is even. And if we wanted the 3 columns to be centered vertically, you could just change this to align items center. Okay, so those are a few options that Flexbox gives us. By default, it's set to stretch. And that's what gives us the built-in equal height columns by default. But because stretch is the default value, we don't even need to include this line if that's what we want. Okay, with that tangent out of the way, now let's finally add the margins in between our columns. Now when we want to add margins, it might be our first instinct to jump over to our CSS, find the rule for the children elements or the columns, and just say margin right 40 pixels. Okay, and that does indeed create margins in between the columns, but notice that that leaves us with an awkward gap to the right of the final column. To get around this, we could target the final column. So we could say callout last child, and then just say margin right 0. And when I refresh, we see that that works quite nicely. But for the time being, I'm actually going to remove that and the margin right property as well. So we're back to not having any margins because I want to show you an alternative way to add margins. I want to show you a way that feels more Flexbox-ish. Now remember earlier in the video when I said that the nice thing about Flexbox is that we don't have to assign width values. Well, we don't have to, but that doesn't mean that we can't assign width values in Flexbox. So check this out. Back in our CSS, within the rule that targets our children or column items, let's actually get rid of this flex 1 line. And instead, what if we manually give each column a width of 30%? Right? So if there are 3 columns, 3 times 30 is 90%. So our columns will take up 90% of the available width. And the remaining 10% can be distributed in between the columns as margins. Now just a general CSS tip, whenever you assign both a width and a padding value to an element, we usually want to also include box sizing border box so that our math stays as simple as possible. So if I save this and refresh, we see that our 3 columns are only taking up about 90% of the available width. And what we want to do now is evenly distribute this remaining 10% in between the columns as margins. Flexbox makes that really easy. So we just target the parent or container element and we say justify content. And by default, this has a value of flex start, and that will align content to the left. So if we change this to flex end, That would align the content to the right. So now the gap's on the left. We could also say justify content center. But in this case, the value we are looking for is named space dash between. Perfect. So that evenly distributes the remaining space in between the items, and it gives us nice margins. Now, if we jump back to our CSS, here's another quick tip. While we technically can use the width property here for the columns, it's not really the official Flexbox-ish way of doing things. So instead of the width property, if we want to be proper here and keep things fully Flexbox based, we would say flex basis 30%. This is the Flexbox way of specifying a particular size. So if I save this, we see that our layout still works the same. So this 3-column layout works well for larger desktop or laptop screens. But what about smaller tablets or smartphones? So you'll notice that as my screen gets smaller and smaller, the 3-column layout looks worse and worse. Right? So this is unacceptable. So on a screen that's this small, we don't want multiple columns, right? So we want the blue box to use the full available width, and then we want the green box to stack underneath it and use the full width, and the purple box stacks underneath that. All right, so how would we use media queries and breakpoints to adjust our Flexbox layout? Well, the good news is that it's really simple. So if you've ever used floats to create responsive layouts, you know that it can be a pain to micromanage the float property, the width property, the margin properties for different screen sizes. But because we didn't use the width value, we used flex basis, and we didn't actually specify any horizontal margins, nor did we have to float our columns, really all we need to do to make this responsive is set things up so small screens don't receive the display flex and justify content lines on the parent element. So check it out. Here's what I would do. I would just cut these two lines, the Flexbox related lines being applied to the parent or container element. I'll cut those to my clipboard. Okay, let's save that. So now notice this is the layout that we want for small screens, but on larger screens, we don't want this. We want our 3 columns to be back in place. So in our CSS, let's create a new media query. So the @ media, let's say screens that are at least 900 pixels or larger. All right, now within this media query, we will target the parent or container class. So that was callouts container. And then we can just paste back in our clipboard. Right? So only screens that are this wide or larger should receive the Flexbox-based properties. So let's save this. We're back in business, and if someone comes to our site on a small screen, they receive a nice single column layout. All right, so I just added this new section to the bottom of the page. And in this example, I want you to think of a situation where you have several different items. So I have 5, but you might have 10 or 20 or 100. So maybe think of a photo gallery or some type of grid of items. And in this situation, we don't want our items to be flexible in size. So in this case, we want our items to have a very locked in size. So I've given each of these boxes a very precise traditional width value of 150 pixels and a traditional height value of exactly 100 pixels. So really all I'm using Flexbox for is to evenly distribute the remaining space in between each of the items. Now this works well when there's more than enough space to fit all of the items on a single line, but watch what happens as I shrink my browser window. So notice the red boxes are staying the same size, which is good. It's just the space in between the red items that is decreasing, which is what we want, but you'll notice that Flexbox is very stubborn. It's stubborn about keeping all of the items on a single row. So even when my screen gets too small to comfortably fit all of the items on a row, Flexbox says, I'm not budging. And even when my screen becomes this narrow and the items are nowhere near as wide as they should be, remember I told them that they need to be 150 pixels wide, Flexbox is just throwing a tantrum and it's not letting the items wrap down to a second or third line so that there's enough space for them to keep their intended size. So the question becomes, how can we tell Flexbox that it's okay to drop down and have multiple rows of items? Well, all we need to do in our CSS, within the rule that targets your parent or container element, we just use a property named flex-wrap, and by default, it has a value of no wrap. And that's what's causing the stubborn behavior. But if we just set this to flex-wrap, and go ahead and save, we see that Flexbox will gracefully drop down to multiple rows only when it needs to. So on smaller screens, we see there are multiple rows, but on larger screens, when it's possible, Flexbox will still place everything on a single row. All right, I just added this new section to the bottom of the page. And our goal for this example is to perfectly center this text within this dark gray box. So we want to center it both vertically and horizontally. So let's take a look at our HTML. The dark gray box just has a class of banner, and nested within it is another div that has a class of center me, and that's what contains the text. If we take a look at our CSS, the container div that has a dark gray background has a set width of 700 pixels and a set height of 400 pixels. Now the div that actually contains the content that we want to center, we are not going to give it a specific width and height value. Its width and height are dynamically determined by just how many letters of text there are in the paragraph and the font size that it's using. Now since the dawn of time, it's been a bit tricky to center content with CSS when the content you're trying to center has an unknown width and height. Now without Flexbox, centering this horizontally would be simple enough. We would just tell the parent element to use text-align center, but centering it vertically, that's always been tricky, right? So one popular way is to set it to position absolute, 50% from the top, and then use transform translate Y to pull it back up half of its own height. Okay, so there are all kinds of different creative ways of centering content, but none of them are super easy or super intuitive. But Flexbox kind of changes that. So watch how simple it is to center this content. We just tell the parent or container element to use Flexbox, so display flex. And then for the child element that we want to center, we just use margin. So you might know the traditional method of centering a block level element horizontally by saying margin 0 auto, right? So this strategy has been around since the dawn of time. It doesn't add any vertical margin, but setting the horizontal margins to auto will center it. Well, by combining this with Flexbox, this margin strategy gets a huge boost. So check this out. This traditional line of code would center something horizontally, but if we just say margin auto, so this will use auto margin in all 4 directions, top, right, bottom, and left, as long as the parent element is set to display flex, watch the magic that this line of code will create. I know it may seem like I'm excited over nothing, but trust me, if you've tried to vertically center content in the past, you'll probably share my joy over how simple this is. So thank you, Flexbox. All right, I just added this new section to the bottom of the page, and this will be our final example in the video. So if you've made it this far, pat yourself on the back. Okay, so this is what I'm starting with, but let me jump over to my other tab to show you the finished product of what we are going to transform this into. So what are we looking at here? What's the goal here? Well, basically we have a 2-column layout, right? So here's one column, and here's the second column. And the effect that I'm trying to demonstrate here that we're going to work on is this column is the main column, right? So it contains the content that is defining how tall this entire block is. And then in our second column, let's imagine that we want to divide it up vertically in half. So no matter how much or how little content lives in the left-hand column, whether this overall block becomes taller or shorter depending on this content, we always want this blue box and green box to share the available height evenly. Now again, this may not seem like that neat of an example, but trust me, if you've ever used floats to try to create column layouts, you know that something like this is trickier to set up than it might seem. But with Flexbox, it's not that bad. So let's jump back to our work in progress tab. Let's not worry about the vertical split right away. First, let's just set up the 2 columns. So let's begin by looking at our HTML. So we have a parent or container element with a class of equal height container. Nested inside that is the first column. So it's a div with a class of first. And then here we see the second column. It has a class of second. And then nested in that, this is the blue box and this is the green box. All right, so let's begin by creating just the simple 2-column layout. So over in our CSS, this is the rule for our parent or container element. So we will tell it to be display flex. All right, here's the rule for our first column. So we can just say flex 1. Remember, 1 is the baseline value when we want to evenly distribute the space. So we will also tell the second column to have a flex value of 1. Okay, so that gives us the 2-column layout. So column 1, column 2. We didn't use any new code or techniques to achieve this so far. And now we just want to make this blue box and the green box evenly share all of this remaining available height in this column. So to achieve that, we're going to nest a flex inside of a flex, so to speak. So within our CSS, this is the rule for the second column, the column on the right-hand side. And nested within that, remember, there's the blue box and the green box. So if we want these two children elements to use the full available space of its parent, we will just tell that parent element to use display flex. Now if I save this and refresh, you'll notice that the blue and green boxes are now very narrow and they're positioned side by side. This makes sense, right? Because throughout this entire video, we've been using Flexbox to share available horizontal space. Now the reason the blue and green box are so narrow is because they only contain one letter, right? So that's all the space they need. But if we wanted the blue and green box to evenly share all of the available width, we know what to do. We've already done that many times throughout this video. So we would just tell the blue box to have a flex value of 1, and we would tell the green box to have a flex value of 1. Okay, but we don't want the green and blue box to share the horizontal space. We want each of them to be full width, and we want them to share the vertical space. Now by default, Flexbox lets you share horizontal space, but we can adjust that. So remember when we told the second column div to use display flex because it has the blue and green children? Well, that means that this second div is a parent or container div. And in Flexbox, there's a property that we can add to container elements named flex direction. Now by default, its value is set to row. And this is why throughout the entire video so far, Flexbox has been divvying up horizontal space, right? Row space. But if we set our Flexbox container or parent element to flex direction column, now Flexbox will divvy up and share the available vertical space. Perfect. And that's actually going to bring this video on Flexbox to a close. We've only scratched the surface of what's possible with Flexbox, but I think this video should give you enough concepts to go and experiment with. If you're interested in reviewing the code I used for any of the examples, there's a link to that in the description. If you're wondering about browser support in Flexbox, I have good news. As of this recording, about 97% of all web traffic will be using browsers that support Flexbox. Now, if you want more detailed information about that statistic, and if you want to learn more about browser vendor prefixes and how that works with Flexbox, I will include a link with more info on that in the description. Anyways, thanks for hanging in there until the end. I hope you feel like you learned something, and stay tuned for a new web development video next Tuesday. Thanks, bye. If you haven't already, be sure to check out my brand new Get a Web Developer Job, Mastering the Modern Workflow course. As always, there's a link to it in the description.